My brother told me, 3 days before his wedding, that he intended to marry a woman he had spoken to exactly once, for perhaps 4 minutes in the rain. "You cannot be serious, Ashbourne," I said, though I knew him well enough to know that he was. My brother did not joke about anything, least of all marriage. He had not joked about anything since the winter our father died and the ice took the bridge at Carden Ford along with 2 tenant farmers, and some said, whatever warmth had once lived in him. They had taken to calling him the Winter Duke by then, not cruelly, not entirely, but because it fit him the way a well-cut coat fits a man who has stopped caring whether it becomes him. Cold, correct, unfailingly dutiful. He ran Ashcombe as he ran his own face, giving nothing away. "I am entirely serious," he said. We stood in his study at Ashcombe, the fire low, ledgers stacked between us like a wall he'd built on purpose. Sir Anthony Calwell was our father's oldest friend. He is dead 2 years now, and I let his widow and her daughter live in that cottage on the Marlow Fen Road rent-free out of respect for that friendship. It has come to my attention that the estate agent means to raise questions about it in the county, and questions become talk, and talk becomes exactly the sort of scandal I cannot afford this season, not with the Chancery matter still open. A marriage settles it cleanly. It gives the girl a home that is legally hers, and stops any man's tongue from wagging about my private charities. You are marrying a woman to stop gossip about your accounts. I am marrying a woman to discharge a debt of honor in the only permanent way available to me, he said, and something in his jaw told me not to press further, though I did anyway, because I loved him and someone had to. "What is she like?" He considered this with the same face he gave a disputed boundary line. "Plain, quiet. I called on the cottage in March out of courtesy, and she said perhaps 10 words the whole visit and none of them memorable. Her mother did all the talking. She kept her eyes on her needlework and did not look up above twice." He said this as a man reports weather, not with unkindness, but with the flat certainty of a verdict already filed away. "She will suit. She will not trouble me with expectations. I do not intend for this to be a love match, Edmund, and I would thank you not to look at me as though I have wounded a puppy." I was not looking at him as though he had wounded a puppy. I was looking at him as though he had wounded himself, which he had, though he would not have thanked me for saying so. And so I said nothing more that night beyond agreeing to stand up with him at the church in Marlow Fen the following week, as his only brother and his oldest friend now that friends of any real kind seemed to have deserted him along with his warmth. I had met Miss Verity Calwell twice before that, briefly, at her father's funeral and once after, when Ashbourne sent me with the quarter's household accounts for her mother's approval. A courtesy he insisted upon, though the law required nothing of the kind. Both times I recalled a slight young woman in a gray dress with her hair scraped back plainer than fashion required, standing a little apart, answering what was asked of her and volunteering nothing. I recalled, too, a set of eyes that did not match the rest of her quick, watchful eyes that moved over a room and seemed to catalogue it, though I thought nothing of that at the time beyond a vague sense that she watched more than she spoke. In a county full of young ladies who spoke a great deal and thought rather less, I had filed her away, as my brother had, under the heading of unremarkable, and gone on to more interesting matters, which shames me now more than I can easily say. Her mother, Mrs. Calwell, was a soft, anxious, kindly woman who had never recovered from widowhood, and who wept with relief when the settlement papers arrived, believing, I think honestly believing, that her daughter's plainness had somehow been overlooked by Providence in her favor. "She has no dowry to speak of, Your Grace, and no beauty to trade upon, and yet you have chosen her," she said to my brother at the small dinner arranged to seal the arrangement, in the girl's own hearing, as though Verity Calwell were a piece of furniture too dull to require tact. I confess I had feared she would end her days keeping my house and no one else's. I watched Miss Calwell's face when her mother said this. It did not move at all. Not a flicker, not a flush, not the wounded stiffening I would have expected from any young woman thus described before her intended husband and his brother. She looked down at her plate, and I thought I saw, just for a moment, the corner of her mouth tuck inward, not distress. Something closer to private amusement, quickly hidden, as a person hides a thought too large for the room. I did not understand it then. I understand it very well now. The wedding was fixed for the second week of April, at St. Aldhelm's in Marlow Fen, the small stone church where her father had preached for 11 years and where, I gathered, half the parish had been christened, wed, and buried under his gentle, threadbare care. Ashbourne wanted it small, no grand affair at Ashcombe's own chapel, nothing to invite the sort of county attention that would set tongues wagging in precisely the direction he was trying to avoid. A quiet marriage to a quiet woman, quietly done, and then quietly forgotten by everyone but the two of them, who would presumably go on living quietly ever after in separate wings of a very large house. I should say now, so that you understand what a fool I was alongside my brother, that in the week before the wedding I called at the Caldwell cottage twice on errands of my own devising, flowers from the Ashcombe glass house for the widow, a question about the wedding breakfast that any footman could have carried, because something about that small stone house on the Marlow Fen road drew me back, though I could not then have said what. The first time, I found Miss Caldwell alone in the front room, and on the table before her lay a book bound in worn leather, spine cracked from handling, and beside it a second book with lettering I did not recognize at all, not English, not French, some harder-edged alphabet that meant nothing to me. She closed them both the moment I entered, quickly, the way a child closes a drawer, and rose and asked after my brother's health with perfect, colorless courtesy, and I thought no more of it than a young lady embarrassed to be caught reading when she ought to have been sewing her trousseau. The second time, 3 days later, I arrived to find her at the cottage's small writing desk with a letter half finished before her, and Mrs. Caldwell fussing over the wedding linens in obvious distress, because the parish clerk had sent a notice in dreadful legal Latin regarding some small property matter of her late husband's, and neither she nor the clerk himself, it transpired, could make full sense of it. "Might I see it?" Verity asked, holding out her hand, and her mother gave it over more from habit than expectation, the way one hands a fretful child something to hold quiet. Miss Caldwell read it once, in perhaps the time it would take me to read an English newspaper, and said, without any drama at all, "It is nothing alarming. It confirms only that Papa's small annuity from the diocese passes to you outright, Mamma, and that no claim exists upon it from his creditors, as Mr. Hendicott feared. The clerk has simply written it in a hand more suited to frightening us than informing us." Then she folded it, set it aside, and returned to her own letter as though she had done nothing more remarkable than pour the tea. I stood there rather stupidly for a moment. "You read Latin," I said. "A little," she said, not looking up. "Papa taught me alongside the boys he tutored for their entrance examinations, when there were boys to tutor, which there were not always. It filled the hours." And that was the whole of it. She did not elaborate, did not seem to think it worth elaborating, and I, to my lasting embarrassment, did not think to ask what else might fill the hours of a clever, friendless, penniless girl in a house with no boys left to tutor, and no mother capable of answering half her questions. I rode back to Ashcombe and mentioned it to my brother only in passing, as one mentions a curious fact about the weather, and he received it with the same mild indifference with which he received most facts about his intended bride, because he had already decided what she was, and a decided man does not go looking for evidence to unmake his own conclusions. That was, I think now, the whole tragedy of my brother in those years, not that he was cold precisely, but that he had trained himself, in the wake of so much loss, never to expect more from the world than the world had lately given him, which was very little and very bitter. He had stopped asking questions of anyone, because questions invited hope, and hope, in his experience, was a debt that always came due at compound interest. The wedding morning was gray and soft. the kind of April day that cannot decide between rain and sun, and settles for a pale, uncertain light that makes every color in a hedgerow look freshly washed. I rode to Marlow Fen ahead of the carriage to see that all was in order at the church, and found the village already gathering in that particular hush that attends a wedding where curiosity outweighs invitation. For word had, of course, traveled that the Duke of Ashcombe, the Winter Duke, feared across 3 counties for his coldness and his exacting temper, was to marry the curate's plain daughter, and half the parish had turned out to see whether the match would prove a fairy tale or a funeral. I confess I shared something of their curiosity, though I would not have owned it. I found a seat near the front, beside old Lady Pruitt, our father's cousin, who had traveled 2 days from her dower house expressly to disapprove of the arrangement, and had said as much to anyone who would listen since her arrival the evening before. "A curate's daughter," she said to me now, fanning herself though the church was cold enough for breath to show. "No fortune, no connections, no accomplishments that anyone has troubled to name. I am told she scarcely speaks. Ashbourne might have had the Fenwick girl or Lord Carrow's niece with her £40,000, and instead he has saddled himself with a mouse in mourning grey to quiet some old debt of your father's. It is a charitable act dressed as a marriage, and charitable acts dressed as marriages rarely wear well by the 10th year, Edmund. You mark me." I did not answer her, because I had no answer that would not have sounded like an argument, and because at that moment the church door opened and my brother came in. He looked as he always looked at public occasions, entirely composed, dark coat, dark hair, the famous Ashbourne bearing that had earned him his epithet as surely as his temper had. But I, who had watched his face across a breakfast table for 30 years, saw what no one else in that church could have seen: a tightness at the corner of his mouth, a stillness in his shoulders that was not calm but the appearance of calm, held in place by main force. He took his position at the front of the church beside the old rector who had come from the next parish to perform the ceremony, since Mr. Caldwell was 2 years in his grave, and he did not look toward the door. He looked, in fact, very deliberately away from it, at a point on the wall above the vestry arch, as a man looks away from a ledger he expects to show a loss. The organ, such as it was, a small wheezing instrument played by the schoolmaster's wife, began the wedding march, and the church door opened again, and Verity Caldwell came in on the arm of the elderly diocesan chaplain who had agreed to give her away in her father's stead. She wore gray. Of course she wore gray. Her mourning was not yet fully out, and there had been no money and no time for anything finer, and the dress was her mother's, taken in at the waist, with a plain veil of white gauze pinned over hair scraped back as severely as I had always seen it. Lady Pruitt made a small sound beside me that was not quite a sniff and not quite a sigh, the sound of a prophecy confirming itself. I heard someone behind us murmur the word mouse asterisk, not unkindly, merely as a settled fact, the way one might remark that a day was overcast. She walked the length of the aisle with her chin level and her hands folded, and if she felt the weight of every eye in that church cataloguing her plainness, she gave no sign of it at all, and I thought then, watching her, that this was not the walk of a frightened girl being handed off to a stranger. It was the walk of someone who had long ago decided that other people's opinions of her were a country she did not live in, and had stopped checking the border. She reached the front of the church and stood beside my brother, and he glanced at her once, briefly, the look of a man confirming an expectation rather than discovering a person, and then returned his eyes to the middle distance, and the old rector opened his book and began. I will own that I did not listen closely to the opening of the service. I was watching my brother's hands, which were clasped behind his back in the old soldier's habit our father had drilled into him, white-knuckled in a way no one behind him could see. I was thinking that I had never in my life witnessed 2 people enter a marriage with less apparent joy in it, and wondering whether duty alone could carry 2 strangers across 40 years of shared breakfasts, and rather doubting it. It was when the rector reached the vows that the first small crack appeared, so small that I think only I marked it, and only because I was watching for cracks. He asked whether any person present knew just cause why this man and this woman should not be joined, as is the custom, and paused the customary pause. And in that pause Miss Caldwell turned her head very slightly and looked, for the first time since entering the church, not at the rector, not at her mother in the front pew, but directly at my brother's profile. A long, clear, assessing look, entirely without shyness, the look of someone taking the final measure of a thing before committing her name to it. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. My brother did not notice. His eyes were still fixed on the middle distance. But I noticed, and something in that look unsettled the picture I had built of her, the mouse, the plain girl grateful for rescue, because there was nothing grateful in it and nothing frightened. There was only a cool, private intelligence weighing a match the way one weighs a bargain, and finding, apparently, that the terms would do. The vows proceeded. My brother spoke his in the flat, correct tone he used for reading estate business aloud, and I ached for her, a little, hearing it, until she spoke hers, and the ache turned into something else entirely. She had a low voice, clearer than I expected, unhurried, and she spoke the old words to love, honor, and keep, in sickness and in health, without a single tremor, looking directly at him rather than down at her hands as brides so often do from nerves. It was not defiance. It was simply that she seemed incapable of hiding behind her own eyelashes, and delivered the ancient vow the way a person delivers a fact they have already tested and found true, which struck me, even then, as a very strange thing for a woman marrying a stranger to sound like. My brother's head turned, just slightly, just enough that I, 3 feet behind him, saw it, though the congregation at large did not. He was looking at her now properly, for what I believe was the first time that morning, and I could not read his expression from where I stood, but I saw the set of his shoulders change, the held calm loosening by some fraction, replaced by something more like attention. The rector pronounced them married. My brother lifted her veil, a small, formal gesture, the kind a man performs because custom demands it and not because he has any particular wish to look beneath, and folded it back from her face. And for one moment they simply looked at each other, the Duke of Ashcombe and the curate's daughter, in the pale April light coming through the old east window. And I do not know what passed between them in that moment because neither of them ever told me the whole of it, though I have my guesses now. Having watched what came after, they signed the register. The organ wheezed back into life. And that, I believed, walking out of St. Aldhelm's into the damp churchyard, was the whole of the day's drama. A plain girl married quietly to a cold duke, a debt of honor discharged, a scandal averted, and nothing more remarkable than that to report to anyone who asked. I was wrong, though the truly remarkable part of that day did not arrive at the altar. It arrived an hour later, at the wedding breakfast laid in the long room of the Marlow Fen Inn, when Lady Curate, 3 glasses of the landlord's indifferent claret into the afternoon, decided that the new Duchess of Ashcombe required instruction. "You will find Ashcombe a great deal larger than your father's cottage, my dear," she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who intends to be overheard, "and I dare say a great deal more is expected of a duchess than of a curate's daughter. You will want French, of course, for the correspondence." Ashbourne's mother corresponded with half the continent, and some acquaintance with the classical allusions gentlemen are so fond of dropping into conversation, so that you need not sit silent at your own table. I do not say this unkindly. I say it because someone ought to, and your own mother, God bless her, has clearly never thought to. The room had gone the particular quiet of a company that senses blood in the water. I saw my brother's jaw tighten at the head of the table. I saw Mrs. Caldwell go pink with distress on her daughter's behalf. I saw several of the village guests exchange the small, satisfied glances of people who had predicted exactly this humiliation, and were gratified to see it arrive on schedule. Verity set down her fork. "You are very good to trouble yourself, Lady Curate," she said, in that same low, unhurried voice she had used for her vows. Though I confess I have muddled along tolerably with the French since I was 11, Papa believed a clergyman's daughter ought to be able to read Fénelon and Madame de Sévigné in the original, since our parish subscribed to no library that stocked translations, and there being no other diversion in Marlow Fen in winter beyond the weather and the sermon. I had a great deal of time to muddle. I have some German as well, though less elegantly, from a curate who wintered with us the year I was 15 and grew homesick for someone to speak it with. And as for the classical allusions gentlemen are so fond of, and here, for the first time, something flickered at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but its close cousin. I own I have read a fair amount of Ovid, and rather more of Plutarch, since Papa's own Latin was better suited to sermons than to conversation, and he liked a second opinion on his translations of an evening. I cannot promise to sit silent at my own table, Lady Curate, though I promise to try not to bore it. The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the one before it. I looked at my brother. I have spent a great deal of this account describing his stillness, his correctness, the careful blankness he had worn like a second coat since our father's death, and I want you to understand precisely what I saw happen to that blankness in the space of those few seconds, because I have never seen it happen before or since. His eyes had come up from his plate and fixed on his new wife with an expression I can only call astonishment, not polite surprise, but the genuine, unguarded astonishment of a man who has just watched a locked door swing open onto a room he did not know his own house contained. His lips parted slightly, as though he meant to speak and found he had no words prepared, because he had prepared for a mouse and been given, without warning, a mind. Lady Curate, to her credit, recovered first, though not gracefully. "Well," she said, "well, I am sure that is very creditable for a country living," and turned her attention pointedly to her claret, and did not trouble the new Duchess with instruction again that day, or, so far as I ever learned, on any day after. But the room had changed, and it did not change back. I watched the guests who had come to see a plain girl swallowed whole by a grand marriage begin, instead, to look at her with the particular attentiveness people reserve for something they have badly misjudged, and are now hurriedly recalculating. I watched the schoolmaster lean toward his wife and murmur something behind his hand. I watched Mrs. Caldwell's distress dissolve into a kind of dazed, disbelieving pride, as though she were only now, at the wedding breakfast, meeting her own daughter for the first time. And I watched my brother for the rest of that meal, unable, actually unable, I think, for perhaps the first occasion in 3 years, to keep his eyes from returning to his wife's face. He did not say anything remarkable to her that day. He was not a man who found easy words even when he had them, and I think the shock of what he'd discovered had left him with rather fewer words than usual, not more. But when the carriage was brought round to take them to Ashcombe, and he handed her up into it, I saw him hold her hand a moment longer than the step required, and I saw her look down at him from the carriage door with an expression that was not quite a smile either, but held the same private amusement I had glimpsed once before at that first dinner, when her mother called her plain in her own hearing, and she had not troubled to argue. I did not go to Ashcombe with them that night. I stayed in Marlow Fen to settle the accounts with the innkeeper, and to walk, rather thoughtfully, back to the little stone church in the last of the daylight, where I found the old rector locking up the vestry. "A fine wedding, my lord," he said, "though I confess I had my doubts going in. The county has not been kind to Miss Caldwell these 2 years, begging your pardon, the Duchess. I must learn the word, not unkind exactly, but careless, the way people are careless of a thing they have decided holds no interest. I don't believe I have ever seen so many people surprised by a young woman they have known, in one fashion or another, her whole life. Did you know what she was like beneath it all, I mean?" He considered this, locking the heavy door with the old iron key. I knew her father consulted her on his sermons, the last 2 years of his life, when his eyes grew too poor to read his own hand easily, and that she read to him in 3 languages besides English and never once complained of it. I knew she borrowed every book the diocesan library at Elsham would lend a woman, and wrote letters to the bishop's own librarian requesting others when those ran short, though I don't know that the bishop's librarian ever learned quite how young the correspondent was who wrote such a fine hand and asked such pointed questions about textual variants. I knew all that, my lord, because a village keeps no secrets from its rector. But knowing a thing and having occasion to say it aloud are different matters, and no one ever asked me, and I confess it did not occur to me that anyone needed telling. She never traded on it. She never once, in 11 years in my hearing, said a word to suggest she thought herself above her circumstances or her company. She simply was what she was, quietly, and waited, I think, for someone to think to ask. I rode back to Ashcombe the following morning with that sentence turning over in my mind, waited for someone to think to ask, because it seemed to me the truest and saddest thing anyone had said about her, and the truest and saddest thing, though I did not yet fully see it, about my brother as well. Two people who had each, in their different griefs, stopped expecting the world to look closely at them, married in a church for reasons that had nothing to do with looking closely, and only accident, Lady Prewitt's wine-loosened tongue, of all unlikely instruments of Providence, had forced the looking to begin. I stayed at Ashcombe the better part of the following fortnight, ostensibly to help my brother settle certain estate matters that had piled up during the wedding preparations, though in truth I stayed because I could not quite believe what I was watching and wanted to watch more of it. It began in small ways. I came upon them in the library on the third morning, my brother reading over a tenant dispute with his usual frown, and Verity, I must call her that now, though it still felt strange on my tongue for some weeks, curled into the window seat with a volume of something in French, and when he read a particularly knotted clause of legal phrasing aloud in frustration, she said, without looking up, "That is simply the old form for a life tenancy, I think. Papa had one very like it in his own lease from the diocese. It means the widow keeps the cottage until her death, not merely until she remarries, which is likely the very point your tenant is disputing." My brother stared at her for a long moment, and then read the clause again with new eyes, and found she was entirely correct, and said nothing at all. But the following evening he brought his correspondence into the library rather than his study, and sat where he could see her, and this became, without either of them remarking upon it, a habit. It continued at dinner, where Lady Prewitt, who had extended her visit, I suspect from a determination not to be routed so easily as she had been at the wedding breakfast, attempted twice more to catch the new Duchess wanting, once on a question of French poetry, and once, rather maliciously, on a point of Italian opera, and was on both occasions answered with such calm, complete, unshowy correctness that she gave up the campaign entirely and took, instead, to asking Verity's opinion on things, which I believe cost the old woman more than any apology could have. It continued in the estate ledgers, where my brother, testing her almost idly one wet afternoon, asked what she made of a column of figures the steward had brought him regarding the tenant farm's yields, and she looked over them for perhaps a quarter of an hour in complete silence, and then pointed out in that same unhurried voice that the steward's own arithmetic contained an error of some £40 in the estate's favor, wrongly entered, and that beyond the arithmetic, the pattern of the figures suggested the northern farms were being asked to bear a heavier burden of the rents relative to their yield than the southern ones, which might in time breed exactly the sort of quiet resentment that turned tenants sullen and unproductive. My brother sent for the steward that same evening. I do not believe he had ever in his life been so glad to be told he was managing something wrong. But it was a smaller moment, some 10 days into that fortnight, that showed me most clearly what had happened between them, and I record it because I think it is the truest thing I have to tell you about my brother's marriage. I came upon them in the long gallery at dusk, where the old Ashcombe portraits hang, my brother's ancestors going back 7 generations in increasingly dark and disapproving oils, and Verity was standing before the portrait of our grandmother, the old Duchess, a formidable woman none of us had ever met, dead before either my brother or I was born. "They say she planted the lime walk," Verity said, as I came up beside them, not having heard me or not minding. "The dowager, your housekeeper, told me. She had it put in the year her husband died, so that she might have somewhere shaded to walk when she was too sad for company and too restless for the house." "I did not know that," my brother said. He was looking not at the portrait but at her. "I thought perhaps I might walk there sometimes too," she said. "Not because I am sad, but because it seems a very good thing, having a place that was made for exactly that, for a person who needs to be alone without needing to explain why." She glanced at him then, and something passed between them that I will not try too hard to describe, because I think it was theirs and not mine to hand about, except to say that my brother, the Winter Duke, feared across 3 counties, who had not, so far as I knew, spoken an unguarded word to another living soul in 3 years, reached out and took her hand, quite simply, in the dim gallery light, and said, "I should like that very much. Perhaps I might walk there with you some evenings, if you would not mind the company. I find," she said, "that I have been minding the lack of it for rather longer than I let on." I left them there, in front of our grandmother's portrait, and went down to my own solitary dinner with a fullness in my chest I had not expected and have not fully lost since, because I understood, watching them, that I was witnessing something rarer than a good match or a fortunate accident. I was witnessing 2 people who had each spent years believing themselves unremarkable, one from grief that had frozen him into flatness, one from a world too careless to ask her a single interesting question, discover, almost by accident in each other's company, that they had never been unremarkable at all, only unasked. The county, of course, could not leave well enough alone, and word of the wedding breakfast traveled, as such things do, faster than any post could carry it, embellished a little with each telling, until by midsummer it was being said in 3 counties that the Duke of Ashcombe had married a plain nobody who turned out to speak 9 languages and correct bishops on their Latin, which was not quite true, but was near enough to the spirit of the thing that I never troubled to correct it. Invitations that had gone unanswered to the Caldwell cottage for 2 years began arriving at Ashcombe within the month, addressed now to her Grace, and I watched with some satisfaction as several of the very families who had called Verity Caldwell a plain little nobody sent their daughters to sit at her feet and beg the loan of books. She did not gloat. I want that understood plainly, because it would have been so easy and so forgivable to gloat a little, and she never did. When Lady Curate finally left Ashcombe at the end of that fortnight, Verity saw her to her carriage herself, and thanked her, with what I believe was entire sincerity, for the honesty of her first estimation. For I have found in my experience that people who tell you plainly what they think of you are a good deal easier to answer than people who only think it and never say. Lady Curate, climbing into her carriage, looked at her for a long moment with an expression I had genuinely never seen the old woman wear before, something like respect, unwillingly given and all the more valuable for the reluctance. "You are a very unsettling young woman, Duchess," she said. "I mean that as the highest compliment I possess." It was some months later, well into that first autumn of their marriage, that my brother said the thing to me that I have carried longest, on an evening when we walked the famous lime walk together while Verity sat reading in the last of the light on the terrace above, close enough that I think he chose his words knowing she might overhear them, and not minding. "I married her, Edmund, believing I was doing a kindness," he said, "settling a debt, closing a door quietly before it could cause trouble. I looked at her exactly once before that wedding and decided I had seen the whole of her, because it was easier than looking twice. I have thought since about how many people must have done the same, looked once, decided, and moved on, for 23 years, while she sat in that cottage being entirely herself and waiting, I think, without ever quite admitting she was waiting, for someone to trouble himself to look twice. I did not deserve to be the one who finally did. I simply happened to be standing in the room when she stopped being willing to stay quiet for Lady Prewitt's comfort, and I have thanked God for that woman's bad wine and worse manners every day since, because if not for that, I might have gone on for years thinking I had married a mouse, and never once discovered I had married the most remarkable person I have ever known. You make it sound as though you did nothing to deserve her, I said. I did do one thing, he said, and here, for the first time in that long and careful account, something like a real smile touched his face, not the courteous stretch he wore for county dinners, but the rare, unguarded thing I had not seen since before our father's death. When she spoke, that day at the breakfast, and the whole room sat there gaping at her as though she'd sprouted wings, I did not join them in their surprise for very long. I let myself feel it because I could not help it, and then I made myself a promise, standing right there at that table, that I would spend the rest of my life making certain she never again had cause to wonder whether anyone was paying attention. That is the one thing I did right in the whole business, and I mean to go on doing it until I die. We walked on a little way in silence, the lime trees just beginning to turn gold above us, and above, on the terrace, I saw Verity set down her book and watch us come and rise, and walk down to meet her husband on the gravel path with an unhurried, certain step, the same step she had used to walk up the aisle of St. Aldhelm's in a borrowed gray gown, while half a parish whispered the word mouse behind their hands, never once dreaming that the quietest person in that church would prove, in the end, to be the one none of them would ever manage to look away from again. He took her hand when she reached him, the way he had that evening in the gallery, as though it were still new to him, and he meant to keep finding it new for as long as he lived. And I left the two of them there in the last of the light and walked back to the house alone, thinking that whatever the county had believed it was witnessing that April morning, a charitable act, a quiet arrangement, a cold duke settling an old debt with the least troublesome bride available to him, what it had actually witnessed. Though it took the room rather longer to understand it than it took my brother, was a man finally being seen straight through by a woman who had been worth seeing all along, and choosing, with his whole stubborn, thawing heart, never to look away again.